Welcome to our online service here at Gisborne Church of Christ. Today we are having the last of the sermon series by Dr. Angela Sawyer, exploring the book of Isaiah. And today she will be looking at chapter 61. And then after that we have something new and special to share.
I want to start with an acknowledgement of country, and as we stood outside today, I think we could really sense and the gratefulness to the traditional owners of this land and pay respect to the elders past and present. Thank you for having me back again to speak on Isaiah, and I feel a bit windswept coming in here from Melbourne and standing outside, so bear with my unruffledness. And that seamless presentation from last week, I'm glad you didn't see the edits of that. I don't think you're allowed to swear that much when you're preaching. Let's start with the actual passage I'm going to be speaking about today, Isaiah 61. I'm not going to read all of it. I'll refer to it as we go through, but I think we need to start with these words. They're really powerful words coming to us from Isaiah 61. And I'm reading from the NRSV version. The Spirit of the Lord God is upon me, because the Lord has anointed me. He has sent me to bring good news to the oppressed, to bind up the brokenhearted, to proclaim liberty to the captives and release to the prisoners, to proclaim the year of the Lord's favour and the day of vengeance of our God, to comfort all who mourn, to provide for those who mourn in Zion, to give them a garland instead of ashes, the oil of gladness instead of mourning, the mantle of praise instead of a faint spirit. They will be called oaks of righteousness, the planting of the Lord to display his glory. They shall build up the ancient ruins. They shall raise up the former devastations. They shall repair the ruined cities, the devastations of many generations. And the passage goes on. So in the first sermon that I came and shared with you, we looked at some passages from the first section of Isaiah, from those first 39 chapters. And many of those passages, if you were to read through, are messages of judgment and doom. And we talked about the context of the 8th century Judah, an impending disaster coming to them. But they were saved right towards the end of that section. And then last week, the passage that I shared was from Isaiah 40, and it was a message of comfort, probably to an exilic community at the end of their time in displacement, a word of hope. And today, this message is from what we consider to be the third part of Isaiah, the post-exilic era, when they're back in the land and everything was supposed to be great and wonderful, and it wasn't. And I'm not going to go too much into the kind of literary and historical background of this passage today. I'm actually going to address it with 3 questions. But one point I will make about the way that Isaiah is structured in this section of the Bible is that from chapters 56 to 66, many people consider it to be a chiasm, and that's a scholarly kind of word for cross. And that the chapters are not linear. So when we were reading 1 to 55, we kind of were reading a story in patches at times, but it's still fairly linear. We get to chapter 56, and it seems to be saying one thing, then chapters 57 says another, and then it seems to be going really well by the time you get to 61. But if you go right to the end of Isaiah, it ends with dead bodies on the street, in a section that is supposed to be hopeful. So the way that scholars tend to read this is in parallel chapters. So 56 parallels 66. And it all comes to a peak right in the middle, and this is the middle. And this is actually considered to be the end of Isaiah, rather than 66, if you read it that way. A message of soaring hope. an announcement of messianic hope. And today's 3 questions that I'm going to ask, stemming from this passage, are: what is it like to be poor, oppressed, afflicted? The Spirit of the Lord God is upon me, because the Lord has anointed me. He has sent me to bring good news to the oppressed. The term is actually poor. To the poor. Some of your versions will have that. The reference is usually translated as poor. Oppressed can cover over that. So what is it like being poor, oppressed, and afflicted? The second question I'm going to ask is: who are the poor, oppressed, the imprisoned? In the world of Isaiah 61, and then in the world of Luke chapter 4, which is where this passage is also mentioned, and today. So who are the poor, oppressed, imprisoned in the world of Isaiah 61, in the world of Luke chapter 4, and today? And 3, what is good news to the poor? What is good news to those who are poor? So that first question, what is it like being poor, oppressed and afflicted? And I couldn't get past this question without telling you my own story. And I don't often tell my story in this way, but I read this passage again and again. I've spoken on it recently in a podcast, and I kept coming back to my own journey. I grew up in extreme poverty. I grew up in a situation with a single parent who was unable to parent me very well because of her own situation. We often went without food. We often had the stress, my sister and I, of wondering how we'd get home from performances at school at night because we didn't have a car, and we'd walk home in the dark. The poverty was systemic. It didn't seem to matter what my mother tried to do. If she tried to work, she'd get in trouble with Centrelink. There was a whole cycle that kept us in this place of poverty. It was entrenched. There were rules to society that we just didn't inherit. In the world we'd grown up in the industrial town I grew up in, that you just didn't know the doorways that you were supposed to go through. The hurdles that were there to overcome. How do you study if you're hungry? How do you sit an exam if you didn't know how to study, if you didn't have mentors, if you didn't have the bus money to get to school? And in the podcast that I mentioned, I talked about a book that I read recently called 100 Years of Dirt by Rick Morton. Rick Morton is an Australian journalist, and he tells his own story about growing up in Australia poor. What does it look like? And he says this: class is access to resources, to culture, to the conversation that people are having about you. For the longest time as a child, I had no idea the conversation about us and people like us was even out there. My ignorance was built on generations of accumulated concerns: survival, rent, food, repeat. No time to make the world big, no one to make it big for you. It takes more time to be poor. And this story resonated with me when I read it. I think Rick Morton probably describes Australian poverty better than most. For those of you who might have seen recently the Netflix series Hillbilly Elegy, you might also hear about American poverty in that story. The book is better than the Netflix series. I think what Rick Morton describes is not only about material issues, it also addresses trauma. And I think that the beauty of this passage that we're reading today is that it addresses not only material issues of poverty, but the broken-hearted state of the people it's writing to. Weighed down, In Isaiah 61, in the historical world, the society seemed to move to another rhythm for some. And this gets me to the next question: who are the poor, the oppressed and the imprisoned in the world of Isaiah 61, in the world of Luke chapter 4 and today? In the historical world behind Isaiah 61 is a real world of rubble, real chaos and real stress. As I mentioned, the return from exile was not glorious. It was not golden. The promises seemed to be unkept. Now, this chapter actually picks up an earlier chapter from Leviticus, this concept of Jubilee, a law that was meant to prevent systemic and inherited socio-economic deprivation, and it brings it to a new era. The concept of the law of Jubilee was to keep people from inheriting poverty generation after generation. It was to break that cycle that Rick Morton talked about in his book. And this was to protect the vulnerable, which was absolutely necessary in that post-exilic era. This is the year of the Lord's favour. When you hear that reference, it's talking about the law of Jubilee. And the day of vengeance reminds us that this God would not allow injustice to continue. Now, we mostly probably hear this passage from the reference where Jesus gets up and starts to preach it in Luke chapter 4, verse 17 to 21. This is to another generation. His first message. He gets up, he unrolls the scroll, and he starts to recite Isaiah. And the thing with the way that Jesus read it out, he doesn't include the day of vengeance of our God. He ends with the year of the Lord's favour, and then basically puts it down and says, this is fulfilled or filled up in your presence. And everyone cheered. It was great. What a wonderful first sermon. And then he continued on. And he started to challenge some of their ideas about those who were excluded in society, and ideas about foreignness and the ethnic tensions that were in this community, and they nearly drove him off a cliff right at the beginning of his ministry. This is not a safe passage. Jesus was talking about two layers when he takes this passage up. The spiritually poor, which we often emphasise today, but he was also talking about the literal poor, and that is what we often neglect. We take these passages metaphorically, and we think that they're always talking about the spiritually poor and oppressed. When Jesus takes this passage, he makes the world big. Remember that quote from Rick Morton, there was no one to make the world big. Jesus makes the world big for the hearers, for those whom no one else would speak to. It was when he challenged the inherent structural divisions in society that kept people out, the ethnic tensions and the othering of people. He smashes that. That's when he's first threatened with death. And my question about who are the poor, oppressed and imprisoned, well, in the world of Isaiah 61, I've talked about the historic world. In the world of Luke 4, it was the outsiders. Today, who are the poor around us? Who are the afflicted and the oppressed and among us? Until the church can truly say that it's not just ministering to the poor, but is made up of the poor, it is not doing its job, and it is patronising and objectifying these people. The third question, what is good news to the poor? What does good news look like to the poor? And I'm going to come back around to my story. So when I was at school and going to school, I would not have lunch. We did not have enough food to take lunch. And one of my closest friends at that time every day would bring an extra muesli bar for me. She would never make a big deal about it. She would just pass it on. And I often joked to her that she probably kept me alive through my school days. She never objectified me or patronised me or made me feel shame about my poverty, but that kindness was necessary. And she also told me about Jesus. A young atheist girl that I was, argumentative and ready to tell everyone that they were wrong about believing in God. She not only told me about Jesus though, she was the hands and feet in feeding me, literally, not just metaphorically. Another story, and Paul, you might not know about this. Paul shared a couple of weeks ago about how we first met in our young adult days at your parents' place. I was very young, it was a long time ago, and I was just starting out as a teacher back then, still very unaware of the rules of the world in Melbourne, which I'd moved to. There was a whole nother language that went on here. You can tell by my accent that I've never quite become sophisticated enough for Melbourne. And Paul's mum, at that time, she knew I was about to start teaching, and she took me out shopping for work clothes. She obviously saw this naive young woman who didn't know how to make my way in the world of Melbourne. Again, she didn't objectify me or patronise me. She was the hands and feet of Jesus to the literal poor in front of her. For me, I'm the first person in my family to have finished high school. I kind of ended up going the whole way. I learnt how to make my way. If I tell my children about my childhood, they just cannot understand or grasp that. This passage has to be about real change. It has to be about more than just a spiritual message, but a real change. Good news to the poor is not just hearing about Jesus. It's actually being fed. It is actually having the hands and feet of Jesus in their life. What does it mean for those who are on the margins to be able to fully participate in society? What do we need to change to make people feel welcome and not shamed? A message like this, "A Spirit of the Lord is on me to preach good news to the poor," is pointless if it doesn't bring change. Poverty is not noble. It is not romantic. It is stressful and painful, and those in it want out. And that's what this message calls for. If we read this message as the peak of Isaiah, a vision of the future that the present world needs today, I would suggest that it is still relevant to us. And as I come to the end of this series of Isaiah and connect with Christmas, we know that Christmas can be a time of remembering and thanking God for the inauguration of the ministry of Jesus. It can also be a really stressful time for those under financial pressure and family pressure. Good news to those who are oppressed means alleviation of that stress. And I think that that's what the ultimate message of Isaiah is to us today. Thank you.
As we finish our time together, we have one new thing to share. Our youth band has composed their own song called Living. And today, some members of the youth band are here to share this song with us. And finally, as we focus on the lead up to Christmas, I pray that you will know God's love, His peace, and His comfort. So now over to the band.
You showed us the way, and you are alive, and we're living for you. You showed us the way, and you are alive, and we're living for you. You showed us the way, and you are alive, and we're living for you. You showed us the way, and you are alive, and we're living for you. I do not need permission. I do not need permission to be living for you. To be living for you. It's my life and I choose to live it. It's my life and I choose to live it by singing for you. By singing for you. Jesus, I am living for you. You showed us the way, and you are alive, and we're living for you. You showed us the way, and you are alive, and we're living for you. I do not need permission. I do not need permission to be living for you. To be living for you. It's my life and I choose to live it. It's my life and I choose to live it by singing for you. By singing for you.